It's,
I was out there searching for stories, you know, I was surfing it.
yeah.
The old
Yeah.
gumshoe, you know.
Yeah. Did you find
I
something? Did you come
did.
across the gem?
I did.
Okay,
I
great.
brought back a new one. So,
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
okay.
And then we'll just kind of finish up after you're done, as this is a trial. But excited for this new gem. Go ahead,
Yes.
Lee.
All right. Thank you, Donnie. This is called An Ocean Runs Through It. There's a woman I've never officially met named Peggy who I swear is living my life. The body snatch started in 1983 when my parents did the best thing ever. They bought a studio apartment at a newly built beach and tennis club on a narrow stretch of land in Amagansett, a small town on the South Fork of Long Island. It cost $50,000, which was terrifying as my parents didn't come from second home stock, and adding another mortgage was a stretch. In retrospect, my dad says he wishes they'd splurged on the more spacious for a family of five one bedroom for a cool 75K. But at the time, we were all young enough to sleep on the pull-out sofa bed or in sleeping bags on our weekend visits before my parents converted it into a tiny one bedroom a few years later. Our building, Starfish, was a short walk to the beach, where for years we delighted in meeting an array of characters, including the fixture we dubbed the Mayor, a perennially tan retiree who was always there but whose wife came on weekends to put a crimp in his so-called style. But not much was known about Peggy, whose semi-private cottage was perched in the dunes. She was the only owner who lived there year-round. The wooden path that led to the beach snaked past her cottage, and I would always look for her as I went by. To me, she was Amphitrite, the Greek goddess of the sea, when, in fact, she was a slight, practically invisible figure with long blondish gray hair and Ray-Ban sunglasses. Peggy often sat on her deck or like a nautical Emily Dickinson, I'd see her reflection just inside the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a perfect view of the Atlantic Ocean just a few hundred feet from her doorstep. How lucky, I'd think as I walked by, wishing I could live there every day, in every season, until the end of time. Peggy had a husband and a daughter, but they came and went while Peggy stayed and stayed. As a kid, I'd spend entire days in the ocean riding my boogie board, and at night, we'd go out to dinner or to the movies. When we'd come home, I'd go out on our deck, press play on my pink boombox, and perform the entire Flashdance soundtrack as a concert for a make-believe audience below, which was really the stone pathway that made crunchy sounds when people walked or cars drove by. I loved that sound, and those summers were heaven. Seafood was the meal du jour. I bought my first album, U2's War, at the East Hampton record store, and I played my first game of doubles on the club's tennis court. I knew I was lucky, but man, Peggy was so much luckier. The summer I graduated college, I lived nearby selling cocktails on the beach and taking reservations at our resort to save money for a move into the city that fall. I spent my first night cold and alone in a dirty roadside motel with no power. I walked to the payphone by the ocean to call a friend. I had never felt so alone in my life, out in the dark and on the precipice of my new life as a grown-up. But a few feet away was the beach, my beach, which was just like being with a friend. So I hung up the phone, went to have a word, and immediately felt better in spite of the loneliness and the dark and the cold. But the best balm of all was magic hour. Those few golden hours as the sun sets, when the haze of summer makes it almost hurt to be alive. The majesty of the ocean and magnificence of nature are unlike anywhere in the world. As a kid, I'd stay on the beach long after my family left to revel in the breeze and talk to the waves. They knew everything about me, and I understood that the ocean is a lot like our lives. It knocks you down and it lifts you up. As those perfect days came to an end, I'd reluctantly trudge back to Starfish, and on my way, I'd see Peggy gazing out over the horizon like I'd been doing, silently spilling her guts and all kinds of secrets. But I'd ignore her, not wanting to disrupt her communing with our ocean, though I was thrilled to know we spoke the same language. If buying Starfish was the best thing ever, the worst was selling it, which my parents did when I was in my late 20s and living in California. It was there I came to know another ocean. The Pacific would never be mine, but it was a perfectly respectable stand-in for my beach back east. Still, my parents spent July in Amagansett for many more years, and I would visit from time to time. And when I moved back to New York and started going there again myself, my lifelong love affair intensified. By then, I had forgotten about Peggy, but there she was every time I returned. I don't know where I left. By then, I had forgotten about Peggy, but there she was every time I returned to remind me that she was living my life. The older I got, the more I felt the pull of that beach and those waves, which had been a constant and from which I always wanted more. But just as the ocean is impossibly beautiful, it is impossible to keep, especially now. I was afraid my friends and I wouldn't be able to visit this summer, but there we were, 15 of us this trip, just last week. It was the first time I'd left the city since all this started. God, I really needed to be there, to be back after all that's happened in my place, the one that feels most like home, and with my best friend, the waves. I admit it was a bit different. My friends and I walked past Peggy's cottage in our masks and carried hand sanitizer while social distancing on the beach. But we did what we always do, too. We played tennis, ate lobster rolls, watched the kids boogie board, chuckled at the mayor, and drank Magic Hour rosé until we were lit by the moon, all the while marveling at how lucky we were to know and share this place. Only one difference really stood out. I didn't see Peggy, not once. The last time I saw her, last September, was the only time in all these years that we ever spoke. She was trying to help her husband into their car. A large elderly man with mobility issues, tiny white-haired Peggy was struggling, and I offered to help. Our feet made that familiar crunching sound on the stone path as I helped ease her husband into the car. Then I insisted she take my number and call me when they returned so I could help her once more. She politely took my number, but I never heard from her. Last week, I thought about Peggy, her husband, and their daughter, who is now grown and living her life somewhere else. And I was reminded of one of my favorite stories, A River Runs Through It, which I read during a cross-country road trip when I was 23, after which I came back to the beach to think about where I'd been and where I wanted to go. But in my story, an ocean, not a river, runs through it. This ocean runs through everything in my life that is mine, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I may not have seen Peggy during my visit last week, but it doesn't matter. I'm sure she was there. We're both there all the time, and she, like me, always will be.